Okay, so next speaker is Jeffrey Kiehl, climate scientist and Jungian analyst.
Thank you. Sean's talk was a perfect segue into my presentation. I hope to answer one of the questions, your question, about what do we do. I think that's really why I'm here. We need a new approach because the old ways are not working. And I personally feel that both the works of Gebser and Jung provide pathways to those new approaches. I just added this figure a couple days ago. This is from the Berkeley group. They collect, one of the many groups that collects the data from around the world on surface temperature, and they analyze that data. And this is the global mean anomaly, anomaly meaning change against the period 1850 to 1900. And you see that up until like the 1960s, the system sort of wobbles around, and then you enter the 60s, and the temperature starts increasing dramatically. And if you actually take this, and it's actually been increasing at a sort of a regular rate over the last 2 or 3 decades. And if you just make the conservative assumption that you're going to continue to go out, you can see that we're going to hit 2 degrees in another 30 years. Okay? And that's the 2 degrees that we wanted to avoid by the end of this century. So we are rapidly warming the planet. I say conservative because there are probably going to be positive feedbacks, amplifiers onto that signal that start kicking in over the next decade or so that are going to actually accelerate that warming. So from a purely physical standpoint, we're in deep trouble. We're in really deep trouble. I'd like to begin my presentation on a personal note. My journey to being here in now at this conference has been a very curious one. My journey connects with the concept of time, and it's interesting that that theme of time emerged as we started, John and I started to collect proposals to this conference. There were so many of them focused on time. I've been interested in time since I was a kid. I still sit around and just ponder about time. What is time? It's a very curious phenomenon. St. Augustine once noted, when asked, that he knew what time was, but when asked to explain it, could not. And I think that's still true. So in this presentation, I want to reflect on time from a climate change perspective, and then look at time through a Jungian and Gebserian lenses. And by the end of the presentation, I hope that you have a sense of how these various ideas relate to one another, and how they may help us work with, and maybe even through, climate disruption. I worked as a climate scientist for 40 years. I began my science career in the field of quantum physics, and then moved into the climate region. My interests in climate have been very broad, and I was lucky to learn from very gifted mentors, one of whom was Paul Crutzen, who coined the phrase Anthropocene. I've studied how greenhouse gases and tiny particles in the atmosphere affect our climate system. I've worked on problems like nuclear winter and the Antarctic ozone hole. And I've also spent a considerable amount of my time looking at how climate and life co-evolved over geologic time. I've been particularly interested in times in Earth's histories when mass extinctions took place and how they were related to disruptions in the climate system. My research has considered processes from time scales of milliseconds to millions of years. So time has been an inherent property of much of my scientific work. And during much of my career, I carried out my research in the so-called scientific position of objectivity, in which I looked at what was happening to our world with a dispassionate gaze. Until one day, I woke up to the profound and deeply disturbing implications of what was happening to our planet. I realized the implications of humans' behaviors on the planet and the serious implications for the future of this world. I realized we humans were quickly returning Earth to a time in the deep past where crocodiles lived within the Arctic Circle and palm trees grew in northern Canada, where there was no ice at either pole and sea levels were enormously higher than today. Right now, as Sean noted, we're a little above 400 parts per million. The last time that we had that much CO2 in the atmosphere was about 3 million years ago, when sea levels were 30 meters higher. If we continue to put CO2 in the atmosphere, it's going to get much warmer. I sat and envisioned the tremendous and catastrophic changes rushing towards us. I reflected on how climate disruption is a problem that holds simultaneously past, present, and future. It is truly a problem existing in all time. I thought of my children and the world we were condemning them to live in, and I wondered how we could continue to do what we were doing to the planet, given our scientific understanding. Why were we acting as if nothing was wrong? And even today, many people deny the existence of this reality. I began to give talks to the public on what we knew about Earth and what we expected to take place in the future. I wanted others to realize the immense importance of what was happening and what we could do to avoid future catastrophic disruption. Then something else happened in my life well over 20 years ago. I decided to go back to school and get a degree in psychology, for somehow I intuitively felt the root cause of our actions was psychological. I wanted to train in clinical psychology, not academic psychology, for I felt it was most relevant to understanding our collective self-destructive patterns of behavior. And after getting my master's degree and setting up a private practice and still working as a climate scientist, I applied to a Jungian training program and eventually became a Jungian analyst. Why Jung? A question someone asked me once after reading my book on climate change. It was asked in a tone implying that of all the psychologies to pick from, why pick one rejected by most academic psychologists? I can't go into all the reasons I was drawn to Jung in analytical psychology. Let me just say that when I read Jung, I immediately felt he was speaking directly to me. And perhaps some of you Jungians here have had that same experience. For me, Jung's views on how our psyche operates in this world makes sense to me. I was especially drawn to his emphasis on the spiritual dimensions of psyche, something he calls the religious function, which is an instinctual part of us. His approach seemed more whole, more comprehensive than other psychological approaches. So I became a Jungian analyst, as well as a climate scientist. And for a long time, I held these two vocations in tension with one another, which was quite uncomfortable. Over the years, I've married them together to address the issue of climate disruption. Out of the two arose the third, very Jungian, very Hegelian. Eco-anxiety. It is very difficult to study climate change, or more appropriately, climate disruption, without experiencing great discomfort. And we've been feeling that in the room for the last 2 days. How can you look at what is happening to the environments around the world and with dispassion? Images of destruction, displacement, and death fill the news. The increasing frequency of heat waves, cities with millions of citizens running out of water, pervasive drought and crop failures with associated migration of thousands from their homelands, You know, a lot of the migration, a lot of the movement of humans in Europe and in the Americas is related to climate change. Collapse of agriculture and people moving to live. The massive extinction of species around the world. I could list many more happenings like this, and Doc has done so, but you know what I'm describing. What is transpiring now is but a foreshadowing of what is to come. As the planet continues to warm due to our inaction, disruption and destruction will only escalate. When I began to give public presentations on the science of climate change decades ago, I would talk about how these effects would be experienced by your grandchildren. But now I must say our children and grandchildren, for the future has met us in the here and now. And these are just some images taken over the last year or two of what's happening, melting of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets at phenomenal rates. All that water's going into the oceans, causing sea level rise, increased frequency of heat waves, storm surges. This is down in Southern California, where after the fires, there was rain, which washed mudslides down, destroying communities, and then drought. And it's not just the impact of climate change on humans. Our more than human world is also being strongly affected by climate change. This is a bear that suffered through that fire. So I've been giving these talks to the public for well over 20 years. I've spoken to groups as small as 10 and up to over 500 people. Along the way, influenced by my training in psychology, I began to ask people, how were they feeling given the science that they had just heard? Overcoming initial reticence, the answers that arose from the audience were intensely emotional. People expressed how hopeless and helpless they felt, given the magnitude of the problem. They expressed denial, anger, guilt. Some even dissociated through listening to the overwhelmingly negative news. They leapt out of time. All of these feelings still arise in people, and maybe you have been feeling that too here, but now are accompanied by a sense of ever-present, generalized eco-anxiety. People don't know how to deal with such anxiety, and sadly, the mental health field is ill-prepared to work with it. We know we need to get off of fossil fuels if we are to avoid ever-increasing disruption. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to transition off of these fuels without causing extreme discomfort. I'm sure you've heard that we only have 12 years left to act. Such phrases have added to the growing eco-anxiety. Does this mean that it is game over in 12 years? No, what it means is that the likelihood of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees centigrade is less than 50% if we do not drastically reduce our use of fossil fuels. But it is difficult to avoid a sense of impossibility in meeting such goals by the science community. There is this sense that time truly is running out. Of course, the greatest tragedy surrounding this issue is that we do have ways of avoiding this extreme warming, but we are failing to shift to these other sources of energy. They're there, they're scalable. We could actually avoid the worst consequences, but we're not doing it. We can't leap. We just can't leap into a new way of seeing the world, which is what is required. In my book, Facing Climate Change, An Integrated Path to the Future, I argue that what is required is a transformation of consciousness, which must occur for us to truly address climate disruption. Our old ways will just not work. What to do? Is it possible for such a transformation to occur? And even if it did occur, what would it look like? And how long will it take? We have known for over 100 years that carbon dioxide warms the planet and that any increase in this gas leads to further warming. 100 years we've known that. Over 100 years. We've even known how much the warming to expect from a doubling of carbon dioxide. And the person who did that calculation is actually an ancestor of Greta. Greta Thunberg. Svante Arrhenius, a Swedish chemist who won the Nobel Prize in the early 1900s. He did the first calculation to show that the planet will warm by around 4 degrees centigrade for a doubling of carbon dioxide. It's a long time we've known this. If we continue to rely on fossil fuels as our main source of energy, then in 80 years we will reach levels that have not existed for 40 million years. That's in 80 years, we're going to take the planet back 40 million years. We know that the world, what that world was like 40 million years ago in deep time, and it was unlike anything our species and many other species have experienced. So the Earth has performed the experiment. We don't, climate models are great. I've spent a long time working on those models. They do actually a very good job in reproducing our climate system. But Earth's performed the experiment. We know what happens when you put that much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Also, unlike the deep past, where changes took place over hundreds of thousands to millions of years, through our actions, the current warming is taking place in 100 years. Essentially, we are accelerating the planet and all life on it back through time. For over 30 years, the scientific community has warned governments about the path we are on. Many have urged us to shift off of fossil fuels to avoid the worst consequences of climate disruption. Despite these calls to action, the concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide continues to increase. Scientists have delivered their message in many different ways, but to little effect. Pundits have pondered how to shift the needle towards action. In the US, a significant fraction of the public still believes scientists disagree as the cause of this warming, in spite of the fact that over 97% of the scientific community are in consensus on this issue. But if you ask the public, 50% of the public believes this is still strongly debated within the science community. Of course, the fossil fuel industry is strongly opposed to any action to address our warming climate, and has invested millions of dollars to sow doubt in the mind of the public about the science. This industry even continues to look for new carbon resources to extract from Earth, including from the currently opening Arctic Ocean, and there's tremendous irony there. Attempts to address the issue have taken place and are still taking place. Tried and true methods of dealing with large problems persist. We continue to provide more factual information, use political negotiation, and to collectively protest. Yet in spite of these efforts, carbon dioxide continues to increase and the planet continues to warm. I'm not saying we should abandon these methods, but clearly we need more than the tried and true old ways of dealing with the problem. I'm reminded of the apocryphal adage ascribed to Einstein that, quote, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. So what to do? And this is where Gebser and Jung come in. From a Jungian perspective, I'll quote Jung here, the gigantic catastrophes that threaten us today are not elemental happenings of a physical or biological order, but psychic events. To quite a few terrifying degree, we are threatened by psychic epidemics. At any moment, several millions of human beings may be smitten with a new madness, and then we shall have another world war or devastating revolution. Instead of being at the mercy of wild beasts, earthquakes, landslides, and inundations, modern man is battered by the elemental forces of his own psyche. This is the world power that vastly exceeds all other powers on earth. And that's the reality, the psychological reality that we have to come to grips with. This is about psyche. Perhaps the most popularly recognized aspect of Jungian psychology is the reality of the collective unconscious, which is inhabited by archetypes. The collective unconscious, being collective, is shared by all humans and most likely the more than human world. I imagine it as a field pervading all living and non-living beings, a field transcending space and time. And within this field are the archetypes, which are patterns of apperception dwelling in this timeless, spaceless realm of psyche. Archetypes developed over evolutionary timescales, providing a transpersonal way of perceiving the world. When we draw close to an archetype, we experience numinosity, in other words, a deep, spiritual, all-filled sense of what is present. Such experiences are ever present, but egoically, we are unaware of their availability. Another quote from Jung: "It seems to me of some importance, therefore, that a few individuals or people individually should begin to understand that there are contents which do not belong to the ego personality, but must be ascribed to a psychic non-ego. This mental operation has to be undertaken if we are to avoid a threatening inflation. To help us, we have the useful and edifying models held up to us by poets and philosophers, models or archetypi that we may call remedies for both men and times." Okay? This mental operation has to be undertaken. To help us, we have the useful and edifying models held up to us by poets and philosophers, models or archetypes that we may well call remedies for both man and the times. And it's also not everybody that has to do this work. This is the other thing that Gebser says, which I'll read in a little bit. We're not asking 7.5 billion people to reach this level of consciousness. Closer to consciousness are our complexes, coherent, autonomous personalities that in a moment take center stage and make us do and say things that only later appear foreign to our egoic state. Overall, our task is to become as conscious as possible of the rich, complex structures populating our inner and outer lived worlds. The deeper reality in these two worlds are actually one, the unus mundus. And that's briefly how Jung looks at the structure of psyche, the totality of consciousness and unconsciousness. We must remember the unconscious. We are so focused on mental, rational consciousness discussions around this issue of climate change that even those of us who work in the field of the unconscious forget the unconscious. Dynamically, Jung argued that destructive behaviors, personal and collective, arise from our being out of balance within ourselves and with the phenomenological world around us. Interestingly, this is what adding carbon dioxide does to the climate system. It puts Earth energetically out of balance. This state of being out of balance arises from one-sidedness. In other words, by investing all of our attention or psychic energy towards one part of ourselves, and then we lose our psychic balance. So the only way to address our neurotic, psychotic behaviors, which is manifesting as climate change, is to restore balance within and in relationship to our outer world. Most importantly, Jung felt that psyche exists as a self-regulating system, which works towards integrated wholeness, which is quite actually reassuring. It means we, our ego, are not on our own. There is something much greater at work in our lives, which is ever present and continually reacting to our tendency to one-sidedness. Now note, this rebalancing process is not always a pleasant experience, for we are very invested in our one-sidedness or being unbalanced, this way of seeing the world. We don't want to give up the familiar for the unfamiliar. This is with Steve's talk, that focus on certainty and our uncomfortableness with ambiguity, uncertainty. The unconscious can cause deeply disturbing effects in our lives, which show up in our psychological state, our relationships, and our bodies. All of these disturbances or symptoms are warning signs to wake us up. The more we ignore these signs, the worse the symptoms become, and if we completely ignore the signs, we imperil ourselves. Again, we can see the parallels with climate disruption. Nature is telling us something. We are talking about serious consequences. So self-regulation is very dynamic, and the indicators appear in the outer world in many forms, as accidents, relationship problems, and synchronicities, while the inner indicators include dreams, visions, and psychosomatic experiences. And so what I'm arguing for is this is information that the world's presenting us, our dreams, our synchronicities, our psychosomatic symptoms. The world is presenting these to us as it's changing. You know, I have clients who are having climate change dreams, you know, the melting of the ice sheets, the animals coming into the dream world, telling us what's required. And we're not listening to that. That's a radical change in how we work with something like climate change. We are talking about many of these indicators are compensatory in nature. In other words, they reflect what is missing in our one-sidedness. They tell us how to complete ourselves, to become whole. Wholeness is the goal in this process, which Jung called individuation. Our telos is to become whole, not perfect, but whole. One last point. What governs this process? Is there a central dimension to psyche that facilitates this dynamic regulation? Indeed, for Jung, there was such a central process, which he called the self, or the archetype of wholeness. The image for the archetype of wholeness is the mandala, and this is Jung's first painted mandala that he made in 1916. Something that the mandala, which I spoke about last year at the Gebser conference in Boulder. So I'm going to end this part with a long quote from Jung. And this is really shifting our consciousness. Now, if it's true that our time and space are relative, then the psyche, being capable of manifesting beyond time and space, at least its part in the collective unconscious, is beyond individual isolation. And if that is the case, more than one individual could be contained in that self. Then it would be like this very simple example which I often use. Suppose our space were two-dimensional, flat like this table. Now, if I rest the 5 fingers of my hand on this flat surface, it appears as only 5 fingertips. They are quite separate, simply spots on the plane of the two-dimensional space. So you can say they are all isolated and have nothing to do with each other. But now erect a vertical upon your two-dimensional space, and up in the 3rd dimension, you will discover that all those simple fingers are of one hand, but manifest as 5. You see, it's quite possible that our collective unconscious is just the evidence for the transcendent oneness of the self. Since we know that the collective unconscious exists over an extraordinary area covering practically the whole of humanity, we could call it the self of humanity. It is one and the same thing everywhere, and we are included in it. Then we have dreams and the material of the unconscious in general, as well as the results of active imagination. They give a certain amount of evidence for the fact that the self can contain several individuals, and also that there is not only one self empirically, but many selves in an indefinite extent. Given what I've said, how could we apply these psychic realities to climate disruption? How would we define our imbalances? Where is the shadow? What needs to be balanced? What messages could we use from the unconscious to bring us back into balance? Now from a Gebserian perspective, I'm just going to read a couple quotes. Humankind, this is Gebser, humankind will have to sacrifice enormously over the next 3 decades. Let us hope that the atmosphere of our planet will not be poisoned for millennia to come by this contamination and killing. This depends to a large extent on the small percentage of people who are able to realize integral consciousness, which acts upon the fate of humankind through the invisible in such a way that it emerges. That's a radical idea for some. Okay? Yes. Humankind will have to sacrifice enormously over the next 3 decades. Let us hope that the atmosphere of our planet will not be poisoned for millennia to come by this contamination and killing. This depends to a large extent on the small percentage of people who are able to realize integral consciousness, which acts upon the fate of humankind through the invisible in such a way that it emerges. That's from The Invisible Origin. So here I admit that I'm a novice of Gebserian thought, and thanks to meeting John Dotson 7 years ago, he pointed me to the ever-present origin, and I've been reading EPO since then, and whatever I can find. Jeremy's book, a new book. I've also found, the essays on the internet. I have to confess that I feel frustrated that there's so little of his work readily available, and I often wonder what I'm missing, especially with the later writings, in how it would relate to this issue of climate change. So I resonate with Gebser's work and see many parallels with Jung's work. Indeed, I see far more similarities than differences between these two approaches. I do not profess to understand all that Gebser describes regarding integral or aperspectival consciousness. But one thing is clear. Just like Jung, Gebser was very aware of the destructive path humanity was on and still is. And he was clearly concerned about how things would turn out and felt that our ability to work through our collective destruction required a mutation in consciousness, an emergence of the aperspectival, which is time-free. Gebser, the concept of an integral time-free consciousness is neither utopian nor illusory, neither is it a form of wishful thinking. On the contrary, it represents and shapes a richer reality. It is a spiritual process which through pain brings with it the assurance that it can be consciously achieved. So let me just conclude. Humanity is facing its greatest challenge in history. That was for Gebser. Humanity is facing the greatest challenge in history. The changes occurring that are occurring and will occur are unlike any our species has faced in its evolutionary development. Civilization developed over relative climate quiescence, the Holocene. However, we're now exiting the Holocene and entering the Anthropocene, and doing it at an unprecedented rate. In spite of all of our knowledge about why this is happening, far too little change is happening to address the problem. We need a great change, not just in technology, but in consciousness. We can no longer look at ourselves as separate from the world. We need to find balance within ourselves and to develop a meaningful way of living with all beings in this world. We need aperspectival consciousness to address our pressing problems. Carl Jung and Jean Gebser provide us with visions of what is needed to achieve these goals. I hope, for the sake of all beings, more of us listen to this wisdom and begin the necessary transformation to create a flourishing future for all. Thank you.
Just wanted to ask about this selection of
Yes, the
slides.
archaic, the magical, mythic. This is Aeon, by the way, and the mental. And then I stole this off of Jeremy's website. There's the integral. Yes.
So you're saying the solution is like a 100th monkey principle, like it is in weather, that with a small amount reaches a critical threshold.
Yes.
It changes.
That's exactly what I'm saying, and it's interesting. I've been part of a group that Jerome, you'll hear from Jerome tomorrow. I'm part of a small group that he's formed called Reciprocity Matters, and we've just added one more person to our group who's works big-time ad person, ad agency. And there's a principle within advertising. I think it's 8%, something at the 8%. You just get 8% and you have a critical mass transformation, okay? So it's not like we have to convince billions of people. We need to be doing the work, changing our own consciousness. I trust the collective unconscious. It truly does connect everything, okay? And you can call it whatever you want to call it, but there is something there that transcends our personal egoic states, okay? It's faster than the speed of light and its ability to communicate, all right?
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I just think this has such potential to transform people. I wonder if you've heard of the book Climate Change and Eco-Anxiety, Surviving and Thriving in Challenging Times.
I have heard of it.
Oh, I think it's your book. It's only existing in the boundless space right now.
Well, let me just say a plug for the book I have written, which is this Facing Climate Change. It's a Jungian perspective on this issue, and some of what I've said here is in that book. So if you're interested in looking at this through a Jungian lens, check out the book. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, let me just add one other thing, which has to do with complexes. There's another dynamic that's acting collectively, and it's this idea of cultural complexes, which was proposed by Tom Singer and Sam Kimball's in both analysts in San Francisco. And Tom's editing a book right now, which is supposed to be out at the end of this year. It's on America's cultural complexes. It looks at all sorts of dimensions of the American psyche. I wrote a chapter on cultural complexes and climate change within the United States, but Fanny Brewster's written a chapter for that book. So you may want to keep an eye out if you're interested in how you scale these ideas up to the social level. That's basically the focus of Tom's work. Dave.
So I don't think it would have been easy to address this climate change and carbon release problem 20 years ago, but I think it would have been easier because proportionately so much of the problem was originating within the borders of this country.
Yes. Yeah.
So how do we address this now that the gross polluters in terms of carbon release have gone global? How do we address this now that Brazil is a polluter, that China is a polluter, that India is a polluter?
Yeah.
And I bring that last example in because, we Gebserians have kind of a romantic view, right, of places like India, that they're more enlightened, they get it.
Yeah, no.
And
we're talking about psyche. It's transcends national boundaries.
And now, I mean, if every Indian who could get a car did, and every Chinese person who got a car did, and every Brazilian who could get a car did, we're done.
Yeah.
That's it.
Right.
There's no turning back from that.
That's right.
So how do we reach beyond a Silomar to affect actual change globally?
Oh, I'm just going to live here forever, in a sense. Good question. Now, what I'm going to encourage everyone to do, and I didn't get to that part of this talk, but what I really want encourage you to do is, with every question like that, How would I answer that question through the archaic consciousness? How would I answer that question through the magical? How would I answer that through the mythic? How would I because our knee-jerk reaction is, and it was mine when you were asking the question. You know what came to my mind? It's the answer I give when I'm asked that. We do it like cell phone technology. Africa did not need to go through the telecommunications evolution that the Western nations went through. They leapt from no phones to cell phones, okay? So if there are electric vehicles charged by solar energy ports that India can buy, then they can have a car for everybody. China could have a car for everybody. Now, what's the real unbelievable reality here? And I've spoke to 200 industry people once on climate change, and I'm looking at them and I'm saying, "You guys, you are missing the opportunity of the world in history of economics. If you developed scalable solar energy and electric cars, you've got billions of customers sitting in China waiting to buy those things. You could make trillions of dollars, you know?" And they just sit there like, well, but cars need gas, you know? They can't make the leap. The irony is that a few years ago, China wanted, this was like 10, 15 years ago, they wanted to scale up their windmills. They put bids out around the world, companies in the United States, all over the world. Did the United States win that bid? They could have made trillions of dollars. The Netherlands won that bid. So the missed economic opportunities they're phenomenal. Why? Because we can't even agree that the problem exists. If there's no problem, why should I build that technology? They're not going to want it. It's like saying nobody in Africa would want a cell phone, so we shouldn't build cell phones. That's the mental, rational approach to that answer. But what I'm encouraging is, what would be the mythic approach to that? What stories? Dan mentioned this yesterday and someone else. What are the narratives? What are the stories that we need to create that don't exist yet? And I'm not so sure we have to go back. These are new stories that have to be created. They can use some of the old stories, but this is Thomas Berry's statement. The old stories no longer work. The new story hasn't been written. We're in between stories. And who's going to write the stories? You people. You're going to write the stories.
Thank you. In response, just a brief response to your question.
Dave.
Again, read this article by Chris Hedges if you want, but not only Chris Hedges. Many people are saying that the proper response would be for the United States and the European Union, but particularly the United States, to show by example not only this needed shift to green technologies and so on, but many people believe that even if we did that, even if India and China and Brazil, suddenly if we could switch them to renewable technologies, but if we did not challenge the myth, the fundamental organizing story of endless growth, consumption, and production, which is a story of industrial growth society led by this nation, but also by Russia. And we're cooked. Just even wind turbines and cooked literally. And all the batteries need cobalt, just a simple example.
Well, that's a shift in consciousness. That's, I write in my book.
Fix just won't do it. Without
the dominant myth of the world today is perpetual growth. And until we replace that myth, and Doc talked about this, until we subvert and replace that myth, we're going to be forever destroying the planet. That's a myth that has to be replaced. perpetual growth. It's based on two assumptions: infinite resources and infinite cheap labor.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thanks.
Well done with the questions.
Thank you.